I just want to ask you one thing.
Please.
Also hearing you now, my feeling in reading the book was that you're always looking for another moment. Even when you're talking about very difficult developments, you don't want to leave us with those difficult developments. In other words, when I said optimism, I felt that you always were conscious that there can be a riot, but there can be other things that are happening at the same time. We're still going to the coffee shops. We're still going to buy food. We're eating falafel. We're eating couscous. In other words, I had a feeling that you want us to think about these experiences as not complete ones. That the riot is not, the anti-Semitic rally is not only an anti-Semitic rally. There are some people who are rallying death to the Jews, but there's something else happening. That was something which I felt was very, very a conscious decision on your part not to leave us always with the feeling death to the Jews. There can be something else at the same time. I don't know if that's the way you felt.
To the microphone.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, really is what gives a sense of, I think, as you say, of possibilities of, at the same time that there's always that ambivalence that no event is without that the other side, I suppose, of the equation, and I think that's. Really, that's what is meant by, a term you use a lot, which I think applies so well, as lives being entangled, for better or for worse, in a sense, and of course there are moments of extreme crisis, and I imagine people who will read your book, and some of them. We'll be looking for these points of crisis, of antagonism, and there are others who will, read the book and look for those possibilities, and probably both of those types of readers won't be totally satisfied, which I think really points to the strength of your book. You don't, as you say, you're not looking at things through starry eyes. You're not idealizing this relationship. It's complicated. It's a messy situation. But at the same time, you're able to sort of navigate through, some of the, and not take at face value some of the really horrible kinds of things that are being said and actions which happen without seeing, I think, the larger context. So in that sense, I think it is it does give some signs of optimism or hope, to be sure. So.
Just let me clarify, first of all, that I raised the question of optimism because I thought this question is crucial for the understanding of the book and its writing, because I think that it is indeed very difficult to write about this topic until yesterday when you know that it is not a complete history, on the contrary. And I would even say more, that I had the feeling that it is in the moments of crisis that you find the hope. I mean, it's in the moments of crisis. It's very easy to become optimistic and because of other moments. But it is within the moments of crisis when we learn that the causes of these crises are also the places in which one can think about the languages, the principles that brings the tensions, the continuous tension. The colonial regime, and I think here that's where sometimes we used to disagree, although I couldn't find this disagreement in the final version of the book, and I was really disappointed, of course. But this is the point, that indeed within this crisis there are other voices, as we can see today, of course, yes? In a moment of crisis, in a moment of mutual hatred, let's say, yes, in a moment of mutual hatred, as part of this process, in which you show us that, okay, here, yes, it's in the right, in this moment, one can think about a different future. That was my impression. So, if you want to comment now, and otherwise.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Katz for the very, very interesting book and also for this evening. On the other hand, I was very surprised to hear twice the fact about the role of the imam of the great synagogue in Paris during the Second War. And it came to my mind that lately I was at the Institute of French Studies, where it was shown a fascinating film about the imam, the mosque, and how he and a group saved Jews during the war, especially from North Africa. There was a panel of scholars that was headed by Professor Chaim Sadon. He's an expert on Jewish communities in North Africa. And we were all really surprised. The film was excellent. And at the end of the discussion, it came out that the whole film and the whole role of the imam, which actually there were pictures of him with the heads of the Gestapo and the SS during the war, but very strange enough, there is no documentation about his role, and strange enough and very bizarre, there are no survivors, no descendants of the survivors that he and his people saved. So my question is there any documentation? Because as far as I understood, there is no documentation, no survivors, and no descendants of survivors. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't want to, I have a lot of respect for Chaim Sadun. I don't want to get into a hypothetical argument with him. He's familiar with an article that I wrote about this very question several years ago called "Did the Paris Mosque Save Jews?" It's in the Jewish Quarterly Review. If I certainly encourage you to consult it if you want to know in great detail more. What I can say now is that it is not true to say there is no evidence, there are no witnesses. This is. I think that let me finish, please. I'll answer your question. I think that it requires, as much as it requires great ignoring of historical evidence to believe that he saved 1,700 Jews, which is a claim made somewhere, as much as that requires a real leap of imagination, it also requires a real leap of imagination to believe that he saved no one. Okay? Salim Halali, who's a very famous musician who I know is featured in this film, he claimed throughout his life on a number of occasions that Zichado ben Gabrit had saved him during the war, and even claimed that this tomb in the Muslim cemetery in Paris had been inscribed with his grandfather's name. That doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from Halali's testimony that a number of his friends or family reported at different times. There was a descendant of someone who worked in the Muslim hospital in Paris, which was also run by Ben Gabrit, who tells the story in a letter about how his mother was notified by Ben Gabrit that basically the things were going to get very, very bad for the Jews and that she should cross the demarcation line, and he helped her to get across the demarcation line. And for the rest of her life after the war, she was very friendly with Ben Gabrit, and he remembers as a small child that she had this great sense of debt toward Ben Gabrit because he had saved her life, effectively. There's another story from a descendant about his father or grandfather who was who was offered or suggested to take refuge in the mosque, but refused to do so. There's also Albert Assouline, who wrote, and who was the first person to talk about this, who was himself, told a very extensive story, very, very detailed story about himself being saved in the mosque. He was an Algerian Jew. He'd been an Algerian Jewish soldier. He was with a Muslim. They were on the way back from a POW camp in 1940, and they found refuge in the mosque together. He talks about that. Some of his details may be off, but he gave the oldest testimony that we know of. There's also a document from September 1940 that says that the Germans have just called in an imam from the Grand Mosque of Paris and told him, we know you are making false certificates for Jews to claim that they are Muslims. You need to stop doing that. Okay, that's a document from the archives of the Foreign Ministry in Paris. Now, look, we also know from other documents that Ben-Gurion was consulted about Jews and whether or not Jews who claim to be Muslim and whether or not they were actually Muslim. And the only cases that I found, and it would require an exhaustive search to know if this is true in every case, but I saw several, 4 or 5, 6, 7 cases where Ben-Gurion appears to have said, no, this person is not a Muslim, and he did this as late as 1943, 1944, so it's a very complicated story, right? And those are cases where he had an opportunity to help save someone potentially that he did not. Maybe it's because he'd already been called in by the authorities and he was in a vulnerable position as a head of a Muslim institution in France, and maybe he was very scared after that. He clearly was prioritizing protecting his own community during the war, like many people were. So anyway, you can read more in the article if you want. It's a very complicated story, but it is not fair to say that it's only a fiction and there's no evidence.
I want to thank the panel for a superb presentation, and I would like to address one of the cores of the question, I believe, and if I understood you correctly, you haven't touched upon the subject of the tension and the distance between Jews and Muslims in North Africa, and I'm one of them. I lived the first 19 years of my life in Morocco, not in Algeria, but I know the similarities are there between the two societies. And I think that it's important to mention here that with France or without France, the tension is there, and it goes back to 2,000 years ago probably, or maybe even more, from the destruction of the temple, when the Palestinian Jews, and there are some Palestinian Jews in Morocco, we know of them because they have a Hebrew name, as opposed to Toledo or people that came from Spain. So they settled in North Africa. The Almohads, les Almohades came and they were expelled to the Iberian Peninsula. The Inquisition came and they were expelled again and went back. So there was hatred within the Moroccan society between Jews and Muslims, and there were pogroms there, instances of real pogroms. I don't know if the people here know, there were pogroms in Morocco that in certain times or certain festivals, Ramadan probably, if a Jew happened to be in the street, that's a problem. So I'm just surprised that you haven't mentioned the origin of the tension, although I know that Professor Ricci, you touched upon it, you were just hovering over it on the subject of the source, and Professor Daniel also started to mention, but you all retracted and you didn't mention it. I wonder why. Thank you.
I mean, first of all, I'm 2 seats from one of the leading experts on Moroccan Jews in the world, so I'm reluctant to go into great detail. Professor Schrader can answer more fully. The book covers a lot. The book covers a century. The book is meant to cover everything about Muslims and Jews in North Africa and France that ever took place. And I don't really accept the premise of your question that the tensions originate in what took place in Muslim-ruled North Africa, full stop. That doesn't mean there were no tensions there. That doesn't mean that those don't have a relationship to what took place in the modern era. They certainly do. I think one should be careful about equating the number or the volume or the seriousness of pogroms in Morocco with what took place in most of Christian Europe, because I think that a serious examination would show that they are not equivalent. But I think you are raising an important issue that is not dealt with in the book, which is more theological dimensions of this encounter, right? I do talk about Islam in moments of the book, but the book does not claim to be about religious relations per se as its central focus. Now, that is partly because I do not see, when I spend many days and years in many archives, I don't see religion leaping from the page as the reason that is driving most relations and most decisions, right? If I did, I would tell a different story. So what I see in terms of Jews and Muslims from Morocco when they come to France, those who end up coming to France are largely nostalgic. That doesn't mean accurately so, but largely nostalgic about their experience together, in Morocco. And we should keep in mind that under the colonial authority in Morocco, unlike in Algeria or to a lesser extent in Tunisia, Jews were not, they benefited in some ways from the Alliance schools, but they did not benefit legally. They didn't have a better status in Morocco. So one might suggest that that contributes to a sense in which the colonial era may have brought certain Jews and Muslims closer together than they were, even though Jews, alluding to the point you made, Jews remained technically dhimmi during the colonial period in Morocco. So I don't mean to suggest that prehistory is not important. I do think the other reason that I talk so much about Algeria in the book is that the vast majority of Muslims who come to France for a very long time are from Algeria. The vast majority of Jews in Algeria come to France, whereas a much smaller percentage and number of Jews from Morocco end up coming to France, and the book is centered on the French mainland. So thank you for the question.
Yeah. Okay.
Perhaps it follows up a little bit to this person's question. As far as brotherhood and optimism and such, I think probably almost all of us here would be very excited if the idea of brotherhood would be something that in the future could arise and be a very accurate label for Jewish-Muslim relations, both in France and certainly here. But what I was wondering was, the title of your book seems to indicate a premise that, especially since it's a book related to history, that at some point, some historical period, that the majority or a large part of the Jewish community would have identified themselves as brothers with the Muslim community and vice versa. And it's been mentioned here also that the colonial period might have upset some kind of balance in that area. But since, as we've also heard just now also, the Jews, from what I understand, always remain dhimmi within the Algerian community vis-a-vis the Muslims. And I was wondering how that would allow for a real feeling of brotherhood between the two sides. And lest it be said that it's only a question of Muslim and Jewish relations, I probably would be asking the same question if we were talking about 500 years of Jewish existence within Poland. Would the Jews there have viewed themselves for any significant amount of time as brothers to the Catholic Poles, and would the Catholic Poles have viewed Jews as being part of and having bonds of brotherhood?
Good question. So first of all, I want to explain about the title of the book, which I think speaks in different ways to different people. What's fundamental to understand about the title of the book, which we haven't spoken about so much here, is that the book, in significant part, is trying to understand the relationship of Jews and Muslims to belonging in France and to the notion of fraternité, which is so fundamental to ideas of the French nation and ideas about who can belong and who cannot in France. And so one of the meanings of the title is the burdens of a notion of fraternité in which difference, ethnic and religious difference in public in particular, is always problematized and is always problematic for one's sense of belonging. So that is one of the meanings of the title of the book. The element of Jewish-Muslim fraternity or brotherhood, or however we want to describe it, I think it's fair to ask the question that you're asking, and I think that the answer is that there have been a number of historical moments, such as Jews and Muslims certainly for a number of years in interwar Iraq, Jews and Muslims certainly in many pockets, particularly of rural Algeria, including well into the colonial period, Jews and Muslims in large parts of Morocco and Tunisia through the colonial period, who did feel, brothers maybe isn't the right word. We have to make titles. We have to make titles that are short. I couldn't make a title that said maybe they felt like brothers, maybe they felt like neighbors, maybe they felt like something else. Okay, so I don't want us to fixate on the word brotherhood, but I think that it's clear that historically there were many Jews who felt absolutely bound up in the fabric of North African culture and who identified very strongly with where they came from as much as they did as Jews. And that there were very many moments in which the laws of the dhimmi were relatively loose, where they were quite limited. I mean, the dhimmi varies so widely across time and space historically that it's very problematic to generalize about it. And there certainly were moments where, for Muslims, maybe Jews, you want to call them semi-brothers, but that Jews were on an almost equal footing and that they were considered central to the fabric of that society. I mean, and I think, one good lens, which is familiar to Israelis more than most, is actually if we look at today in Morocco, where there still are Moroccan Jews who, throughout the history of the independent state, have been close to the king. There are many Moroccan Jews who, fairly or too nostalgically or whatever, feel the Moroccan king has been their protector. There are constant calls for Jews to return to Morocco, and every single year there are thousands of Israeli Jews from Morocco who go to these pilgrimage sites, many of which are shared with Muslims. Does that mean everybody always got along great and everything's perfect and there's no Muslims in Morocco who are anti-Semitic toward Jews today? I'm not making those claims, but I think that's just a good lens for the fact that there are significant numbers of people in many of these places who feel a very strong sense of kinship.
Good evening. First, thank you, Professor Katz, for this amazing presentation about France. I have first a short remark and then a question that seems to me to be important. First, I'm a French Jew doing my Aliyah now, and I can tell you it's not because of the Muslim anti-Semitism, but most about the Catholic pushing the Arabs, more often non-religious, against the Jews. That's how I felt it as a French person. Now the question, it seems to me, and that's here the difference, in my opinion, between France and Spain. Most of the, maybe not the oldest, but at least the more influent Jewish families in France are actually not Sepharad, but Ashkenaz. And the Rothschild are not from North Africa. If you remember of the history, Dreyfus was not from North Africa. And they are very ancient families. And they are very emblematic for the French people as what Jewish people are. They are bunkers, they are rich people, they are people who will not be playing cards with a Muslim guy in a cafe. And most of Ashkenaz people I know in France would not like to mix with Arabs, actually. Don't you think, didn't you find in your research that it has been a bridge that cuts the Sepharad Jews from their Muslim country origin, and that the fracture maybe came from that?
Can you clarify the fracture came from?
Yeah, from the fact that the Ashkenazi Jews got a very much influence in the Jewish community and pulled the other Jews, the Jews from North Africa, to be more French finally than Arabs.
Right, so I do talk about that dynamic that you describe a fair amount in the book, and I think that you are, I'm not go quite as far as you, but I think that there's no question that Jews from already during the First World War. I tell a story about an Algerian Jewish soldier who is really annoyed that he keeps reading articles in the mainland French Jewish press about how Jews are serving in both the Zouaves and the Tirailleurs. The Zouaves are made up mostly of either colonial settlers or Jews, French citizens in Algeria. The Tirailleurs are made up mostly of Muslims. And so he writes this letter and he says, there are, we are full French citizens, not like the Muslims. There are branches of the Tirailleurs that don't allow the Jews to even serve. Please note the difference, I beg of you. It will be better for us and for our good friends, the Tirailleurs. Okay? So that, and that's part of a larger discourse, right? And in the 1960s, when all of these Jews come from North Africa, many of them are trying to avoid being seen as Arabs. And many of them are described sometimes by Ashkenazic Jews as too Arab, right? There's a story I tell about, a Jew from Algeria who hears a Ashkenazic Jew who lives in the building say one night as she shuts her door, they're Algerians. We had better lock our door. Algerians, they have knives. You know, and sorry? But I'm talking about the Jews from Algeria. We can. It's a whole other debate whether we want to call them Pieds Noirs or not. I don't think it's the most useful term, but some of them consider themselves Pieds Noirs. That's another discussion. But I'm talking about the racialization of these Jews in many contexts as Arab, or the desire to escape that potential racialization, which I think is part of what your question was pointing to. So I do think that is certainly a factor. At the same time, and if we look at a lot of different areas where Jews and Muslims live together, there is some kind of persistence, places like Belleville, where a lot of Jews moved out, but a lot of Jews still live there to this day, and there still are all these Arab corner stores that Jews go to, and there's still, a sense of shared Maghrebi identity among a certain number of residents in that quartier, despite the fact that, yes, you have these prevalent discourses, you still have a certain number of people who connect to those roots. So.
I think it was a great way to conclude this evening in a way that shows that it is impossible to conclude all aspects of the crucial questions in which this book is dealing. And indeed, many questions of these complex relations between different communities of Jews and between others, questions of colonization and decolonization, questions of the past that bring us to think differently about the present and the future. So I, first of all, thank the three speakers for their illuminating lectures, and mainly thank again Katz, both for your presentation today and particularly for this great book. One thing I can promise you, there are many issues in this book, many questions can be raised, but if you start reading it, you will not leave the book. And this is a great achievement for an historian, as everybody knows. Thank you very much. Good evening.